tonight, and welcome to the Decameron Project's conversation with the wonderful Elizabeth Acevedo. I'm Lucas Gimbel. I'll be one of your hosts tonight. I'm a founder of the project, and with me today is Ria Alawalia. Ria is a high school student in New York, and she's a winner in one of our many story competitions. So we're really thrilled to have both of them here. And Ria and I are also bringing you Elizabeth with the help of NYC Service and the New York Public Libraries. And the public libraries have been so kind as to make Elizabeth's work available to you all for free through the New York Public Library online. And as you can see behind me, I've got the Poet X and With the Fire on High. I'm missing Clap When You Land because my mom's reading it. But anyway, you all can see all her works and more through the NYPL online, which you can get to through their Simply E app. So a big thanks to them for doing that. But without further ado, we'll get right into it. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. It's really our honor, our pleasure to have you here. And we hope you're doing well. Thank you.
Of course, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. You can hear me okay, Lucas?
Yes, sounding good, yeah. So I guess I'll start with a question that we like to ask many of the great authors that we have the fortune of joining us. And it's a question because we are, the Decameron Project is a youth organization. We're by students, for students. So I think it's an important question, and it's pretty simple. Why do you write young adult books?
It should be simple, yeah? Except when I began writing and when I was writing poetry, I think I was gearing towards a more adult audience. It might help to know that I was an 8th grade English teacher for a few years, and it was in teaching 8th grade and seeing the kind of literature my students had access to and the kind of literature that they desperately craved that I kind of leaned into the challenge of, I've been a writer, but there's something that makes me think I can't write a real book. And let me confront that and see what it might mean to try to offer my students what they're asking for, right? I have the skills to write. I can probably teach myself to write fiction. And it was really that kind of mandate of just wanting to address what I saw as a huge lack in the American literary canon.
Totally. That's so interesting. I know that, you know, teaching is such an important part of young people's lives. You get to see an inside of their lives and growing up. So I want to ask you about what was something that struck you about young people today, whether it was their engagement with the performing arts or being creative or writing. What was something that really inspired you about those children?
You know, honestly, the wit, the honesty, the ways in which I knew how my students felt about me because they would tell me, right? And I think when people write young adult fiction, we would read a lot in class and I would read a lot out loud. So I would listen to my students say things like, you know, that's not realistic, that would have never happened, or an infantilization that can sometimes happen with young people, while at the same time you might get a rush to grow kids up quickly, right? Like, oh, well, you're mature, you should be able to handle that. And so it was that strange space of not quite adult, not quite kid, and that occupation in there of watching folks grappling to become who they want to be, that is incredibly exciting for me. And I think as a teacher, I would just take note of what was there, but certainly the intellect, right? And the ability to handle, I think, a lot of what the world throws at them. There's something about that age when you are learning to stand on your own and those firsts that come along, and maybe challenging some of the things your parents have taught you, maybe starting to try to create your own kind of structures and rules around how you want to live as opposed to what's been imposed upon you. There's something really exciting about, you know, what y'all face. And I like the ear of it. Like there's a talking, there's a speech that just feels so generative to me. So I'm always ear hustling when I'm on the metro or when I was teaching, like, all right, what am I going to steal to include in the text?
And so you mentioned that you were a teacher for a little while, and you write young adult books, and now many of your books are being taught. So what do you make of that? Did you ever think that you might end up in the curriculum?
No, I didn't. I thought this book has too much cussing and too much Spanish and way too hood, and like no one would teach this. And not because I didn't see the merit, but because I did not have enough faith in the kinds of texts that can be brought into the classroom and the kinds of teachers that would find something here and really be able to say, you know, I think there's imagery here we can analyze. I think there's empathy here we can talk through. I think there's poetic devices and literary devices, as well as, you know, really interesting characters that I don't think we see often enough in academia in any level. But no, if I were honest with you, I was like, this book is going to get banned out the wazoo. And it has been, and it's been amazing to watch teachers and superintendents and students, you know, stand up for what they think it represents. So I couldn't have imagined this.
Yeah, you know, I'm so thankful to have books like yours being taught in my school, because it's so different from the standard practice of what I've been reading in my education. So you mentioned that, you know, people are not always gonna like your book, and it has been censored. About a month ago, I think in North Carolina, there was a suit filed by parents of a student because of its, quote, anti-Christian sentiments. So I want to ask you about your reaction to that, and what you would say to people who reject the message of your book, or who just reject your book in general.
You know, I really don't think I have a lot to say. I think students have been saying enough. If you two could organize to have 300 people show up to an event and get an author to be here and work with the New York Public Library, my agent is emailing me like, I thought they were full grown-ass adults. Like, I think I have to give credit to the fact that young people can handle a lot of complicated messages, and particularly in a school setting where you can discuss, where there are places to turn to if something is triggering or is difficult. I cannot fathom what we believe that a book where a young person is saying, I have been silenced, I am unable to speak up and speak out, I have questions and I'm being shamed for having questions, that's the book that you want to say kids can't read. You know, to me, it just feels like I try to be so intentional about not prescribing messages. I don't want to tell you how to feel about the characters. I don't want the characters to tell you this was the point, you know, let's all burn down Christianity. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I respect that there are a lot of questions that come up, and it is worthy to have those questions clearly and explicitly depicted on the page and then muddled through. Right. And I think I trust my readers. I trust my readers, and I trust that if a book isn't for them, they'll be like, this book isn't for me. And thank God there's so many people writing, you know? And so I don't know, having been a teacher, I think it's so difficult to get young people interested in a text, or it can be, that to ever deny a young person the opportunity to read something that might be powerful for them, if they are willing to read it. I just have to question the where that's coming from. And I think adults often let their fears kind of be what they try to channel, that, oh, young people can't handle it. And I can't think of a major movement in this country where young people weren't the catalyst. So I am very much trusting that you all can handle a lot. And I write with tenderness, you know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to throw all of this violence and stuff at you either. I think I hold readers carefully in a story. What do you think, Rhea? Lucas, what do y'all think about this controversy?
No, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think it's so awesome to have authors to write about these kinds of stories, because like you said, they have trust in their readers. We're a young generation that's going through a lot right now. And if anything, we need authors like you to be talking about important issues like coming of age and challenging your ideals and all the rest. I agree with you totally.
No, I think
still agree, but I'm glad you do.
Rhea's hit the nail on the head, though, I think. We're talking about the Poet X, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to kind of dive into the Poet X a little bit and talk a little bit about, because I think it's an interesting theme, religion in the Poet X. And I know that Xiomara has an interesting relationship with the church. You know, in one of the first pages of the book, she says that Jesus feels like a friend who invites himself over too often. So I was wondering whether any of Xiomara's conflicts and ultimately her relationship with religion reflects any of your own personal conflicts of faith.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you grabbed that passage. It's a passage that's often quoted as why the book is anti-Christian. And, you know, I think that whenever we're raised with certain doctrines and they intrude on what we think we want to do, or they make us feel guilty and shame, it does feel like an intrusion. Like, you arrived, I didn't invite you here. I didn't invite shame into the room, right? But here you are. And I think that was kind of the sentiment that I was trying to get across. But you know, I'm writing about this woman who has questions about her body, about her place in her neighborhood, about her place in her family, about her place in Harlem, about, you know, what feels like a hyper visibility and an invisibility in what she thinks about herself in the world. And to me, to deny that, you know, the Dominican Republic is an incredibly Catholic country, that people come from the diaspora, and it is a part of how that community navigates immigration, that faith, the church has a place in how immigrant communities, you know, from Latin America are able to find each other. It felt like it had to be a part of the texture of the text, right? And I think I had a very different approach to religion than Xiomara did. I did my confirmation. I've done every sacrament that it was possible for me to do. And so we had different kinds of questions, but, you know, I don't think what she's asking is any less worthy than what I was asking when I was her age. And my relationship to Catholicism is one where I greatly respect what it's done for folks like my mother, who, without her faith, I think some of the hardships she's gone through would have been, I mean, my mother's an incredibly strong woman, so I don't want to say it would have broken her, but faith is huge. So I recognize that religion can do that for folks, but it just doesn't work for me. Catholicism, it's not, I don't feel as attuned to myself or my my self-worth as I'd like to be.
Totally.
I don't know that I had navigated all of that when I was writing the book. And I'll also say I do not like reading books about religion. And I actively tried to resist writing a book that touched on religion. And I just could not, I couldn't, it just was so compelling for that character. And for me, I center the narrative, the protagonist, and the conflicts they have before my own messages or what I desire.
Yeah. You know, Xiomara goes through a lot in the book, deals with issues of identity and religion and much more. And I think that story is not just in it of its book. It's an experience that so many people resonate with. And you talk a little bit about the Dominican side of Xiomara and how, you know, important that is with her, you know, evolving journey with identity. And, you know, it's interesting because in my school, and perhaps many others, we're actually reading the Poet X in a Spanish translation. So I was wondering how you felt about that translation. Does it deliver the same way? What is the kind of effect of reading poetry in Spanish, especially this kind of book?
Ria's trying to set me up. You're trying to get me in trouble with my Spanish publisher. No, you know, Spanish is my first language, but it is not the language I wield easily anymore. I struggle to communicate difficult or complicated ideas in Spanish. I just don't have that vocabulary. I don't read in Spanish. I don't, you know, create analysis in Spanish. And I speak every day with my parents and I'm quite fluent, but what we're talking about, the language we're using to talk is a limited vernacular of the everyday, not how do I express these, you know, advanced ideas of race and gender and religion. And so I was intentional when I optioned the book in Spanish that I wanted to be able to look at the manuscript, which I don't do with most of the languages the books have been translated in. And I had my cousins help me and read through it and kind of give me feedback on what didn't come across as Dominican and what did. But publishing is difficult in that it often gives most of the credence, or not credence, but it pushes for the largest kind of audience. And in Spanish, it was Spain. And it was, well, a Latin American dialect that is aligned to Spain. And although we were able to work on it and make sure some Dominican Spanish came in, it is something that I'm considering, the ways in which I want to make sure that books moving forward are in Dominican or Caribbean Spanish, because it's not enough to have it still holding up a colonial language as the language when that is not the language of the characters. So that's a great question, and it's something I'm definitely thinking through.
No, certainly, and I want to touch on that actually for a moment, because I know that your Dominican heritage is very important to you. And I actually read in the Atlantic when I was preparing for this interview that the night you won the National Book Award, you went to your parents' house and you had some sancocho. You celebrated with that, and coupled with I know with the Fire on High, food is very important. How has kind of food and your Dominican culture influenced your career and your work?
Yeah. This always is a hard question for me. It's hard for me to separate the influences that come up, right? I haven't been anything but Dominican, and so I can't, it's hard for me to say like, well, I think if I were this, I would have approached the text differently. I can only kind of root my story in, yeah, I think my ideas of gender have to do with how I was brought up to consider gender roles. I think my ideas on love are based on the relationships I saw my aunts and uncles have and my cousins have. But it seems difficult to kind of parse out what is authentically, whatever that means, Dominican, and what isn't. But I'll say that I grew up with a lot of stories, right? My mom didn't necessarily read me fairy tales, but she would tell me about where she was from. And the fantastical behind this woman who was a campesina, who lived in the countryside, who's one of 15 kids, whose father had a third grade education, but could tell, riddles that lasted 30 minutes, like her rooting me in the place where she grew up through story was huge. And so I come from an oral tradition. I come from a tradition of, I will tell you where I'm from so that right? Like that, I think that's what my mom was trying to do. And I very much know that the way I perform my Dominicanness is in direct response to how I understand Dominicanness based on my mom. Like she was the vehicle for me to receive culture. I received it in how I looked. My whole neighborhood was Dominican. Like I got it there, but she was kind of who I looked to be like, oh, this is what a Dominican woman is, right? And so the way that moms come up in my work, the way that daughters come up in my work, the way that women setting boundaries or having to navigate that, I think is cultural because it is my kind of speaking to my mom in some ways, or to what I think she's taught me that I've learned or have had to unlearn.
Right.
That was a super complicated answer, Lucas, but y'all ain't seen some complicated questions, so
we're glad. I'm sure everybody's glad to have the complexity. And I wanted to ask you just about another big part of your life, which is that you're a New Yorker, and growing up in the Big Apple is a great, in many ways, a great place to be an artist. And this is sort of another influence question, so I'll try and phrase it a little bit differently, because I want to know how kind of New York has shaped you and maybe has given you certain opportunities.
Yeah, and I can actually make a comparison for this one because I've lived in Washington, D.C. for the last 15 years. So I know how my adult life has channeled very different influences in terms of the city I live in versus my upbringing. I am lucky enough to do a lot of presentations back when you could go out into the world. And I was doing about 50 to 100 a year. I visit a lot of schools. I visit a lot of different cities and states. And I see spaces that don't have access to public art, that don't have art community centers, that, I can't kind of be like, oh yeah, you could go through a poetry workshop, because there is no teen poetry workshop in that area. There isn't a big poetry slam for teens. There, that kind of, I had my choice of activities in New York. I did theater. I was part of 5 different nonprofit organizations doing leadership work and activism and poetry in the arts, right? And doing trips. And so I think I was so privileged. And it's one of the things I consider, right? That there are different kinds of privileges. And for me, the access I had, because New York is a city of so many artists, the fact that I saw professional poets who performed when I was 13 and could look and say, okay, that's a possibility. That's something I could do. I don't take that for granted, right? That you can't be what you can't see. And in New York, you see so much, right? And in some ways, I'm also glad I left. I'm also glad that I got to go in a smaller pool and work on my own stuff and not be in not the machine, but New York can be very competitive. And it was nice to kind of just get quiet and, well, what does my voice sound like when I'm not in competition with other people? And that was also powerful. So I don't know. I love hearing about different writers, and depending on who you speak to, I love hearing stories like Gwendolyn Brooks. Depending on where she was, you could hear in her poems the lines were, and that was Chicago, or how it kind of slowed down. And she's powerful about how space affects our cadences and what we write. And I think New York, you can hear it in my work.
Totally. You know, I loved watching slam poetry. Even in New York, it's such an awesome opportunity to go see young people and to see creative people just deliver this awesome performance. And I wanted to go a little bit more into that because to people who don't know what slam poetry is, I want to ask you to explain what it means to you, the performative aspect, the rhythm, the uniqueness, the catharsis that comes from delivering your message in slam poetry.
I will start off by saying that depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different definition of slam poetry. I think it's a misnomer. I think we have poetry, and there's poetry that sounds really good performed. I have heard people slam with sonnets. I've heard people slam with palindromes. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, slam poetry it has a lot of connotations that I want to just make sure people kind of make sure to parse apart. And they tend to think you're more of a performer than a writer when you do slam. But what I love about slam and what I think is powerful about poetry slams is what does it mean for a person, and particularly a young person, to get up and take up space and for 3 uninterrupted minutes, say something, right? And particularly when you're a teenager. I know I used to have so many insecurities about my body and how I looked, and how, you know, am I coming off too much this? Am I coming, you know, like all of these things. So for me to get on a stage and of my own volition demand that attention and say, in this moment, I'm going to believe that what I have to say is powerful. Right? That, I think that does something to a young person. Not because a teacher made me, not because it was a school project, not because of anything, except I wrote something and I honestly believe it is worth sharing. I think that gift to yourself is incredible. And so I love it for that. Oh, and if you don't know what it is, what is a slam poem? What is poetry slam? It is a competition. I like to think of it as an arena. It's a really cool way to package poems. So if you have ever watched figure skating, a slam is where a group of people go and compete against each other. They memorize typically, although you could read, about a 3-minute poem, and then judges hold up a scorecard and you get your score. And if you do really well, you advance. And if you don't, you get the opportunity to write some more and come back next week. And that's, it's the competition is just a fun way to bring people in.
And I know, you know, you mentioned that some people have said that you're more of a performer when you're a slam poet, but I know that actually before you became a poet and a writer, you wanted to be a rapper. So how has kind of, you know, the musical side and rap and music, you know, influenced your work and your career?
Yeah, I mean, at the literal level, I'll say that I think one of my projects is to kind of archive hip hop and bachata and bolero and merengue that we don't see in literature, right? So in the Poet X, I mean, I feel like I was giving folks a playlist of Nas and Meek Mills and I mean, J. Cole, like all these, you know, I managed to get Nicki Minaj and Cardi, even though Cardi's album hadn't come out yet, but just this way of saying hip hop was so critical to my upbringing, and it's such a part of the world of my characters that it deserves to be named. Even if some of the folks I name in the years after disappoint me, but I think that part of being in a living genre that's still growing is, you know, I want to chronicle the growth. I want to be a part of how that is involved, and I think my writing would be really different and probably not as compelling if I weren't a listener of hip hop if that wasn't an influence on my work. And then on a different level, I'll say that I listen to a lot of music. I have a playlist for pretty much every novel. And so I have a sense of what is the world that the characters are listening to, even though I may not personally be listening to it, but trying to really make it rich for myself so that when I'm writing, I kind of know, like, what would Imani be hearing? Like, would the Roots be something she's listening to? Is that too old school? Like, would it be Meek? Would it be, Freddie Gibbs? Like, what's the world? And I think it helps me not sound too old.
Yeah, those influences are really important, especially for young people. Constantly, this inspiration that we get from authors and writers alike, it's just part of our life. So I want to switch gears a little bit to the content of your poetry and of your writing that involves a lot about women and especially violence against women. I've read numerous poems of yours where you basically speak about issues that have been going on and have been going on for a very long time. You even go so far to say that you hope that the life of this poem will be short because you won't have to talk about this anymore. So I want to ask you perhaps a two-part question, but the first being, how do you see that us as young people or anyone how do you see us making our society more safe and welcoming and supportive for women? And do you have hope about the progress of our society in making those works obsolete?
I think that the role of young people is really to take seriously the charge of communication, right? Really taking seriously the charge of asking, is this comfortable? Does this work? Do you want to do this? How do you feel? Are you okay? Right? But also like explicit conversations of consent, being able to have those conversations with people they trust in advance. I think that so much of when I'm talking about rape culture in particular, which I think was the poem where I'm talking about, obsolescence. I want the many poems I've written about rape culture to be completely obsolete. The way in which we monetize off of young women being depicted in particular ways that may not even be organic to who they are. And I'm thinking here of the movie Cuties, right? Which was a completely different movie in France and then came to the US and had this whole super sexualized marketing campaign. And that to me is an example of rape culture. Why is this how we sell this story of these young girls who want to dance when that is not what the story was? If it was about them empowering themselves sexually and like what it means to be a young person who explores that, great. But that wasn't what that was, right? And so I think that my work is trying to shine light on those little moments of we are not having enough conversations. And I think young people, it helps to have a touchstone, right? If you read the Poedex and you're like, yeah, I've been hollered at. I think it's amazing for young men and non-binary folks to read that and kind of have to sit with, oh, have I made someone uncomfortable because I like snapped their bra and I thought it was all fun and games, or because I slapped their butt and everybody does that and I thought it was cool, or, I jumped in on the joke that everyone was making, but I didn't make the joke. Like, I think seeing that on the page and having to sit with, oh, this is so familiar, makes me uncomfortable because I think I've maybe been on one of the ends, right? Either the person who does this or who receives this, and that's not okay. I think we have to have those conversations. So I hope young people will just push to have more talk about what it means to really, truly be empathetic towards each other. Do I have hope? I have to have hope. I have to. I think that I try to be really purposeful in my life, period. I try to move with intentionality. And if I did not think there was such a thing as better, it would be difficult to do what I do. And it feels unfair to be like, I trust that young people are going to save us. And I think a lot of people say that. That's incredibly unfair to put that on folks. I think I want to see if I can agitate the waters enough that young people have these conversations and do my best to be a facilitator or assist, but I'm not going to put the entire onus on you all. So I have hope, but I have hope for For those of us who are old who can change, for those of us who are old who can retire, for those of us who are, can be supportive and pass the mic in addition to you all.
Yeah, I love hearing that. I love hearing people who feel and find faith in all groups of people, because it's all of our jobs to be having these conversations, and especially with the kind of violence and the kind of distress that so many people are going on with, like in a pandemic that's just creating up spikes in domestic abuse and the attack on Black Americans, like pervasive in our country. These conversations, I feel, need to happen. And one of the ways that with what you mentioned, in order to get these conversations going, is creating books that reflect this kind of message. So I want to ask you about the impact of children's books and their ability to reflect the diversity of beauty and of women, and how much do you think that has helped your readers, and what other changes do you think we can make in literature?
How do I think that the diversity depicted in my books affect the readers, or they navigate it? Yeah, I think it's really exciting to consider that I wrote a book and I was like, no one outside of New York and probably particularly Washington Heights is going to get this book. And then going all over the world and realizing, when you get hyper specific about a group in a community, you touch on the universal. And it's always been true in writing, but it felt particularly true with a book that felt so niche. And yet people want to talk about, oh, I was a twin, or people want to talk about, I also have a fraught relationship with my mom, or people want to talk about all these things, that there is something about depicting diversity that actually sheds light on, oh, I didn't know that, but also I didn't know this about myself, right? It connects us to ourselves. And I think the distance that is crossed, I thought I was so different from this character, and yet there might be things they're mulling over that I have also had to grapple with. For me, that is the joy of reading. It's what happened. It happens in between what I've put on the page and then what the reader receives. It's that kind of alchemy of a new thing happens because we're both bringing experiences into the mix. And so I hope, I went to Kansas. I was doing a school event, and there's like this white guy in overalls, a trucker hat, and he's in the back and he does not look happy. And I'm keynoting and I'm like, oh, this is the day. This is the day. It's going to go down. It's 2018. There are all kinds of negative things that are happening on the road, and I'm meeting folks and all, I'm seeing a lot of things that make me feel like this is a country that does not love me. And I'm like, yo, this dude, there's a big dude in the back. And he comes up to me at the end. I'm like, all right, Liz, you're okay. It's going to be okay. You're okay. And he goes, I wanted to meet the author that's had my son read this book twice. My kid who doesn't really read. And when I asked my kid why he was reading the book, he told me that it reminded him a lot of his mom, who had passed a year before. And this is like a white kid in Kansas who I never would have thought, the Poet-X is for this kid. But the Poet-X was for that kid. And I think that it's not just the diversity in the books, but it's the diversity of audiences that are able to find things in a novel that maybe I didn't intend, but you never know what speaks to someone. It could be that someone is queer. It could be that someone's a poet. It could be that all of these things I put in there are really just speaking to a variety of people. And I've stopped doubting the text, but I'm also really particular. Like I write characters that I don't often see. And so I'm not trying to write diverse characters. I'm trying to write queer Latinx characters because we need more queer Latinx people represented. I'm trying to write Afro Latinx people because we don't have enough Afro Latinx people. I'm just writing the world I want, not necessarily like, oh, let me check off all the diversity boxes so that schools will feel like this is super inclusive. No, let me write society as I think this character needs in order to get a message across, and with all the aspirations of how I want queer young people to be treated and Afro Latinx people to be treated and teen moms to be treated.
Completely. I think, one of the interesting things you touched on there is the ability that literature has and that art has to make people walk a mile in one another's shoes. And I was wondering, in English classrooms, right? And we've got a lot of teachers watching, I'm sure. How can they look you know, to make sure that that every kid in their classroom has somebody, you know, has a book that they can relate to, and that they can, you know, feel that kind of same connection that you just spoke about too.
Yeah. You know, this is tough because I think so many teachers try the best they can within the curriculum, within the standards and the objectives mandated by the county, right, to ensure that they are giving really rich literary lives to their young people. But it's a lot to push back against. And I'm thinking particularly public schools, and particularly Title I schools, who don't maybe always have the ability to kind of be as flexible as more, you know, more affluent schools and more affluent districts. And in those spaces, I think it's hard when you have 10-year-old class sets of something and your school's like, well, you just better use it again. And you're like, I wish I could just, you know, do the work of bringing in some of the text that would really affect here. The number of emails that I get of people asking for free books, and I wish I could give class sets to every school teacher that reaches out. But there's a huge problem, I think, between what we think young people will value and how we think about objectives and standards and what young people need to know. And then what a lot of teachers, I think, feel personally mandated to do, which is teach a love of reading. And that is not the same thing as teaching an English class. And that gap is huge, right? And so I think we need to find a way where it's not just donors choose, where teachers can figure out ways to get class sets of things that they could teach. And there's a lot of programs that exist, but I think from the educational system, we need a different direction in how we think of the demographic of particular schools and the text that they need for that school, right? Hyper-specific focusing on text. And this isn't necessarily the teachers as much as it is to administrators and you know, school council folks. But I think young people also just saying it. When my student looked at me and said, none of these books are about us. They don't sound like us. They ain't about kids from Langley Park. They're not Black and Latinx. Like, I don't want to read this. That was a mandate. Like, I went out the next day and got Sandra Cisneros and Jacqueline Woodson and Julia Alvarez and Walter D. Myers. I realized I had failed in my classroom and just grabbing the books that they had in the storage room and then putting it up. No, I need to be present with what my young people need now. But it's hard work. And so I love doing writing assignments. I loved asking folks, like, you tell me what you want. You tell me what you're going through. Let's do journal entries on what moves you. And then I could get a sense of, oh, this kid is really going through this. Maybe this book would help. Or, you know, dang, I think this young person, maybe sci-fi is the thing. And like that being well-read and diverse literature isn't just the cast of characters. It's also letting young people see lots of different kinds of genres. My husband would tell you he did not consider himself a reader because he'd never been given nonfiction, and he just didn't like fake stuff. He's like, this is fake. These aren't real people. And the moment he got, you know, Malcolm X's autobiography, he's like, this is it. And he loves nonfiction. And if someone had seen that earlier, you know, he probably would have considered himself a reader earlier. So I think there's a lot of entry points that need to kind of have people at the post.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think that exposing people to books that they can connect with, they can have the opportunity to connect with, can really push people to be young, avid readers and writers. So before we get into the Q&A, we have one
I'm just having my charger, but I'm listening.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
We're going to ask you one more question before we head into the Q&A. We have a bunch of questions that people want to ask. But our final question is, for the emerging young writers, both at the Decameron Project and beyond, as coming from an author who's been through it, has been through all the nitty gritty, what's the best piece of advice that you have for young writers who are trying to get their creative selves out there?
Okay, I'll grab my charger when we go into the Q&A. I don't want my computer to, I have this old laptop from like 2012. I get this question often. I think that there's a couple of pieces of advice that I would have really valued when I was coming up as a writer, and it's the best that I can offer, right? Write a lot, write daily, write all the time, as much as you can. Don't throw anything out. Don't crumple anything. Trust in revision more than you ever trust in a first draft. A first draft is you just telling yourself a story. A second draft is where you really start seeing the point and the purpose. don't show everything to everyone, right? I think sometimes we get super excited and we think this poem is for the whole world and don't realize like, oh wait, I might have not been ready yet. This might still be something that's really hurtful, and my giving it to Rhea, and Rhea's like, take out this paragraph and this is trash and this image isn't enough. And you're like, but what about my feelings, right? So I think realizing like not every piece of writing is for the world. Some of it is just for you. There's no acclaims and accolades coming. It's just, I needed to tell myself this, right? And so I'll say all of that. And I also say, and this is twofold. On the one hand, I think imitation has a lot of purpose. I like when folks are trying after poems. I like when people read something and, you know what, I want to try a persona poem. I want to try a poem that you know does this thing. I think that's important. And I also think it's important to stop looking for a blueprint. Oh, this writer had that kind of career and that's what I want, so I'm going to do all the things they did. And that can be really tempting when one is trying to figure out their own voice and their own path to just try to map onto someone else. But I think it's important to break free of the blueprints that you think you have to have and just follow the writing. Did I answer your question?
Totally did.
Okay.
Yeah, so take a minute, get the charger, and we'll begin our Q&A. For everybody in the audience, some of you have reserved your spot for this event with a question, and we've got a bunch of those lined up. And I know many of you are asking them live. So Rhea and I will do our best to get to all of them in the limited time we have left. Yeah, so we'll great. Ready?
Ready.
Great. So I've got an interesting question here. This is one of our pre-registration questions. And it's from Sandy Ben, who's a teacher. And she asks you, what writer has influenced you the most and why?
I think I always go back probably to my formative years of writing. And it's not because more recent writers haven't had a huge impact on what I'm currently writing, but I think when I needed an anchor to feel like a writer and to feel like I was in conversation, the poet for me was Lucille Clifton. And when I was 16 years old, I did a poetry workshop at Urban Word, and the teaching artist brought in Lucille Clifton's poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? And the last 3 lines are, won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. It is the only poem I didn't write that I have fully memorized. And it was because of what that poem offered me. And I think I learned so much in how I was drawn to that poem and then to all of Lucille Clifton's work. And, oh, this is what a writer can do, right? If you write something that moves you, it might lead someone else to want to imprint it in their body, right? And that's like super tempting, but Lucille to me was such a spare writer, such a smart writer, and she got to the heart of things. And I really value that from, and I valued that as a young person, knowing like this is the godmother of all my poems, and like I am well treated in the world if that is true, right? I want to be Lucille when I grew up, or I didn't think that, right? Because that poem also has a line like, I had no blueprint, born in Babylon, and for me it was okay. She didn't have a blueprint either, and she made it all right. I'm gonna be okay. So I'll say she was super formative both to my writing and to my person.
Yeah, totally.
And Jacqueline Woodson, I gotta say, I'm so sorry to cut you off, Rhea, but I think Jacqueline Woodson is one of the most amazing writers living today. I don't think she gets enough flowers. And I was reading her when I was in 8th grade and read Miracle Boys and Lena. And I'm still reading her. And I think to have that kind of career with the integrity she's had and still love the community she writes for is huge. So I'll say Jackie, as more recently, has become like the icon I look to.
That's really cool. We have a question from a teacher, Sarah. She says, Elizabeth, I've loved the Poedex and your explanation for writing it. I also love Stamped by Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds. As a teacher, I often get asked by my students why they don't learn much about the origins of discrimination toward Hispanic/Latinx descent in the U.S., or the role of Hispanic/Latinx people during the time of the slave trade. It seems to be a huge omission of our history. Have you ever considered writing about this subject?
Yes, I have a short story I have a short story, and now I'm tripping on the name. Yes, I have considered writing about it. I write about history pretty often. It comes up all the time. I think American history and how it treats Latinx people, probably less my cup of tea, because it's so recent. It's such recent history. I mean, we're talking mostly, the 60s, when the a large wave of immigrations from Latin America started coming out, mostly when dictatorships began falling, mostly dictatorships that were upheld by the United States. But so that's a huge part of it, but it feels too recent. I'm really interested in like the rupture of colonialism and the moment of the New World. And so when I look at history, I'm looking at like 1521 and what it meant for enslaved people to be on the island of the Dominican Republic. But it's a different access point. And I completely agree. There's been such an erasure of Afro-descendant people from history, period. And Caribbean people and Caribbean Hispanophone people from a lot of how we think about race. I don't know that my project is necessarily something like stamped, but I think I'm trying to show the ways that generations are affected by how discrimination works. And I have one short story called Gilded that's about 1521 and a rebellion. And it literally is looking at the enslaved groups at Christopher Columbus's son's sugarcane mill, who were the first people ever to rebel on this side of the world in terms of against slavery. So that's kind of where, if I were to look at history, I would want to start the beginning.
Thank you for that. And we've got another question. This time it's a live question. And it's actually from an anonymous asker. But he or she is asking about Clap When You Land. And they say, chess is such an important part of Clap When You Land. Do you play chess? What prompted you to include it as part of your narrative?
Yeah, I wanted to write a chess player for a long time. I was part of the program Chess in the Schools when I was young, so I learned to play chess in 4th grade. Both my older brothers played chess, and my father got my eldest this is old school. It's from Radio Shack, this like huge board, and it was an electronic board, and he would have to like do the machines. It was just so old school. But I watched my brother play chess my whole life, and we would play together. My husband is an avid chess player. And I think there's something a lot about how you have to be organized, how you have to think ahead, how you have to be well-versed in openings and closings, right? Like there's so much metaphor in the language of chess. It's been really surprising to see a show like Queen's Gambit on Netflix kind of getting the prominence it's getting, while I also put out a book that had someone who's, a chess champion. And I think there is something to be said about the kinds of people who are drawn to chess as a game, right? And so for me, I wanted to think about this young woman, and also that there was a huge move at one point in the Dominican Republic for people to play chess, which I don't think would be subscribed to us, but it is very true. My uncles play chess, my father, so it's not what you would typically think was an activity of this country that's known for baseball. But it was a big part of a lot of people's kind of, learning of this game. There was a rush at one point. So it was nice to be able to kind of drop those facts in, but mostly characterization. I thought it'd be a really cool container for this character to have this really analytical mind that she's really good at, even though she doesn't love this thing, but it's taught her so much of how to prepare for any battle.
That's a great answer. Totally. We have, I think, time for a few more questions, but this is another live question from Andrea. This is about your writing process. So she says, when you write, do you start thinking first about the themes that you want the heart of your story to be about, or does the story come first and the themes start manifesting themselves as something that belongs to the story?
I don't think of themes. I think I want the stories to tell me what they're concerned with, and to impress a concern too far in advance gets to what I was saying earlier about trying to avoid messaging. right? I think there are messages that come through. There are things that come through. When I'm revising, I refine like, oh, Xiomara, is talking a lot about wanting to be free, and this bird image keeps coming up. I'm going to make sure to really pull that through the whole text. Oh, Imani, I really think it's important to address boundaries, right? Now that I see her pushing back against her father and saying, I don't want you to treat me this way, maybe I can make that a clearer thing that she's not able to do in the beginning, that she's learned how to do by the end. But I don't go in with that. I go in kind of like, let me see what will happen if I peek into these corners and take these detours and allow the character to be in really difficult or interesting situations. For me, the message or the theme comes much later.
And we've got another question here from Artemis Live. And she asks, how much of an impact did your teacher, Mr. Bildner, have on your career? And how can other English teachers be more like him?
How you know about Mr. Bildner, Artemis? Oh man, Phil's my man's, yo. I got to go to school and we got to call teachers by their first names. It was a very hippie school. So Phil is Phil. We were just emailing actually. The impact that he's had is beyond what I can probably appropriately explain on this call, right? Like this was a person who I had in 6th grade and in 8th grade who saw a reader where a lot of folks hadn't seen a reader, who gave me every single book. When we talked about diversity, like he would throw anything at me. And he knew I was voracious and he knew I wanted to be able to say I finished it. So he challenged me to try a lot of different kinds of texts. He also challenged me to write letters to authors. And my little 12-year-old self is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna write this whole letter to Lori Hoss Anderson, tell her what I think about her book. And I'm gonna write this letter to Angela Johnson and tell her what I think about her book. And Phil would send these letters. And funny enough, Angela Johnson never wrote back, but her book, The First Part Last, was dedicated to me because when I wrote her, I asked her about this character and I mentioned like, I think he needs his own story. And so, this was a teacher who gave me the gift of seeing a reader and then seeing a writer and seeing someone who could analyze text and give feedback on literature. And I think he allowed me into that space in a way that was important. But what is also important to note, when I was a school teacher, my 2nd year of teaching, Phil called me and said, I'm signed to an agency. He's an author now. And there's an agent looking for lyrical work, and I think your poetry would be perfect. And the reason I got my agent and got the poetic signed and went to auction and have the career I have was because Phil used the positioning that he had to bring along this student he had 15 years before, whose voice he believed in, right? And that doesn't mean I may not have written a book eventually, but it is the kind of opportunity I know doesn't happen for everyone. And him just seeing that and tracking my career path and tracking my writing and connecting me to folks. Yeah, I can't even speak to how much I love that man. What do I think teachers can do? Track your students, make sure you're aware of what they're doing. Help them be readers, help them be writers, ask them questions about how they're doing. Make sure you say hello every day. I used to shake all my students' hands, which now that we're like in the middle of Corona, I'm like, how did I do that? How did I not get sick more often? But I think just that moment of, I'm gonna take a few seconds to say, I see you every single day. I think does something to the relationship you have, but also I could tell when, maybe this person's off or they're a little quiet today. I'm gonna give them a second. I think, it can be easy to get caught up with everything but the young person in front of you sometimes.
Yeah. Those teachers are really helpful, especially during these years. I have a Spanish teacher who's on this event right now, who's really been there for me. I'm going to shout her out. Senora Pimentel. She is
Senora Pimentel is lit.
No, she's awesome. And she's definitely been that support for not only me, but for so many students. And having her introduce your book into our curriculum is something I'm super grateful for as well. We have I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, but this is a pre-registered question. This is from Kashia. She says, are you ever afraid of writing? Not a fear of failure per se, but a fear of telling the story.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the wall behind me. I have all these Post-its up. I'm currently working on my first adult novel, and it cuts really close to some things that I know well. And a part of me has had to navigate how much of my family feels feels like it is mine to write about, and how much of my family, like, that's not my story to tell. And I do think it's a different kind of exposure of what I think and believe. And it's really scary to be so vulnerable on the page. And so I get afraid. I mean, I have anxiety, so I get afraid quite often. All the time I'm just like, it's not gonna work. So, you know, I'm probably more fearful of craft, honestly. I'm very comfortable with, it's going to be emotionally hard. It should be, right? If it matters to you, it's going to be hard. Even if it's joyful, the doing of the work, the pulling of something out of your body is work, and it's hard. But for me, my biggest fears are often craft. I think I'm incredibly ambitious in what I want a project to do, and that's often harder for me to reassure myself, you have the skill to do this, as opposed to what you're writing is difficult. I've been writing since I was 8. I've been writing things that hurt or that didn't make sense since I was 8, and I'm comfortable that writing is how I understand. It's how I think. And so I'm less afraid of that, as much as I look forward to, well, let me figure out what I'm thinking in this moment. And that's what the writing will do. For both. You said 2 more questions, but I'm just always out here talking. I think we can fit one more in, though.
Yeah, we've got one more in, and I think it's a really nice note to end on. Anonymous attendee is asking if you can share one of your poems with us.
Oh. Yeah, why don't I read from the 3rd novel, which, if you haven't seen, is called Clap When You Land. I will say that Clap When You Land is based on a true story. In 2001, or true event. In 2001, 2 months and 1 day after the attacks on the World Trade Center, a plane crashed on its way from New York to the Dominican Republic. There were about 260 Dominican nationals on that flight. No one survived, including 5 people on the ground. Because it was so close to September 11th, it was initially thought that it was also a terrorist attack. And when it was determined it was mechanical and pilot failure, there was just a difference in how I think the flight was treated, the descendants of people on the flight were treated, and the story was treated. It maybe wasn't quite as juicy anymore. And being a part of that community, growing up in New York, having seen the ways that tragedies could be dealt with, there was something that hit home about, you know, why don't we have guidance counselors at school for this? Where are the grief counselors in the neighborhood? Where's the support for the fact that, you know, 300 people disappeared in the course of 5 minutes, and that jostles a community. And so the book was based off of that wondering and became a lot more things. And it follows 2 sisters, Camino and Yahaira, who don't know about each other until their father dies in a plane crash. And this poem is called Mud. It's not called anything because I don't have titles. I'm gonna call it Mud. It's in Camino's voice. That's the sister in DR. I know too much of mud. I know that when a street doesn't have sidewalks and water rises to flood the tile floors of your home, learning mud is learning the language of survival. I know too much of mud. How Thea will snap at you with a dish rag if you track it inside. How you need to raise the bed during hurricane season. How mud will dry and cling stubbornly to a shoe or a wall to viralata the dog and your exposed foot. I know there's mud that splatters as a motoconcho drives past, mud that suctions and slurps at the high heels of the working girls I once went to school with, mud that softens, unravels into a road leading nowhere. And mud got a mind of its own, wants to enwrap your penny loafers, hug up on your uniform skirt, press kisses to your knees and make you slip down to meet it. Don't let it stain you, Diaz always said. But can't she see? This place we're from already has its prints on me. I spend nights wiping clean the bottoms of my feet, soiled rag over a bucket, undoing this mark of place. To be from this barrio is to be made of this earth and clay, dirt packed, water backed, third world smacked, they say. The soil beneath a country's nail, they say. I love my home, but it might be a sinkhole trying to feast quicksand, mouth pried open, And so I hunger for stable ground somewhere else. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Wow. Beautiful.
Awesome.
Thank you. And thank you again, Elizabeth, for joining us. This has been wonderful. Thank you to everybody who came. We were so glad to have you. And everybody stay safe, stay well. And we hope to see you all soon. In the new year, we've got Jason Reynolds coming up. And we've got Marlon James at some point, as well as a host of other opportunities. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Ria. And bye-bye.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.